if you take a look at the classification of life in general, we can classify all life on Earth according to what was termed the Linnaean system. So this was developed by Carl Linnaeus, and it is still used today to classify things what we term taxonomically. So if you take a look at life in general, all life on Earth can be divided into three main domains. Those domains are bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. And all of the organisms that fall within these domains will have shared characteristics. So bacteria, for instance, will be very, very small. They'll also have a cell membrane, and they'll be very simplified in structure. Domain archaea will be a little bit larger in size, and they will have certain cellular characteristics as well. Within the domain eukarya, all of these organisms will have what is termed a eukaryotic cell type, and the domain eukarya can be divided as well into different types of kingdoms depending on their characteristics. So within the domain eukarya, we have these main classifications. Kingdom Plantae, which consists of all the plants. Kingdom Fungi, which is all the mushrooms and fungi. We have Kingdom Animalia, that is all of the multicellular eukaryotes. And then we also have Kingdom Protista, which consists of all the protists. So you will also find, if you look at different sources, there might be other divisions that are not present here, but I'll say for testing purposes, please refer to the textbook and the classification that we use here, because that is what the tests and examinations and quizzes are based off of. So once you divide things up into different kingdoms, you can also further divide these organisms it's all based on shared characteristics. So from kingdom, you can divide up the groupings of organisms into different phylums, different classes, then different orders, different families, different genus, and then finally to a specific species. So as you get down in this classification system, you find that there's more specific characteristics that these share, and a species is very limited in the number of shared characteristics that they have, and it would get broader as you go up in this classification system. So to give you an example, I'll give you an example of insects, because that is my specialty. So insects, they would fall under the domain eukarya, under the kingdom Animalia. So this includes all the different animals that are present on Earth. So this would include the various phylums, such as phylum Porifera, the sponges, phylum Mollusca, the mollusks, phylum Arthropoda, and various other phylums that are not included here, just for simplification purposes. So if we take a look at the phylum Arthropoda, which is where the flies fall under, this would be all of the various arthropods. This can then be divided up into the subphylum Hexapoda, hexa meaning six. So this would be all of the six-legged arthropods. This will then be further divided into class Insecta. So these are considered to be the true insects. So they have a distinct body form, which means they have a head, thorax, and abdomen, and they also have 6 legs. The class Insecta is then divided into various types of orders, such as Order Purchura, Order Collembola, Springtails, Order Thysanura, Bristletails, and so forth. So if we get to the order Diptera, Diptera is diptera, meaning two wings. So flies have 2 wings. That is their shared characteristic, among other things. So within the order Diptera, you can have many different families, and these would be representative of the different types of flies. So you can have family Pyophilidae, these are cheese skipper flies, family Culicidae, your mosquitoes, family Calliphoridae, which is your blowflies, and there's many other families that are not included here. Within the family Calliphoridae, you would then be broken down into various types of genuses. So this genus in particular, in this example, is Calliphora, because these would include the bluebottle flies. And you see here, there's 3 representative species here. They all look very similar. They all have a blue sheen to them. They all have 2 wings. and they all have various other shared characteristics. But if you do take a look at them close enough, you will find certain characteristics that split them apart, and that would split them apart into different species, and then that would be an example such as here, Calliphora vicina. So when you have a species name, such as Calliphora vicina, that really represents the genus Calliphora and the final species Vicina. So if you take a look at Homo sapiens, we belong to the genus Homo, and the species name is sapiens. So this then brings us to the concept of evolution by natural selection. So evolution, the theory of evolution, was originally proposed by Charles Darwin. He theorized that living things become adapted for their environment by what is termed descent with modification, which means that as a generation progresses, so as you go from a parent to an offspring, there will be small adaptations that would make them better suited for their environment. And these adaptations would eventually be passed on amongst generations and changed amongst generations. So the method of natural selection is interesting because it actually acts on an individual level. So what that means is that you have to have certain characteristics and certain things be present and acting upon an individual. And when it acts upon many individuals at the same time, and eventually over generations, you would get the evolution of an entire population. So even though it works at the individual level, the results are seen in the entire population. And let's see why. So according to his theory of natural selection, there are certain things that must hold true. And the first thing is that individuals in a population vary. So what this means is that genetically, individuals are not identical. So you have to have genetic variation in order for natural selection to occur. So if you had a population of clones, for instance, you would not have natural selection occurring because there would not be any genetic diversity. You have to have genetic diversity for natural selection to act. The second thing you need is the overproduction of offspring that would lead to something called competition. So there has to be some sort of limiting resource. You have to have the overabundance of individuals being produced. And as a result, these individuals are going to be competing amongst each other. This competition then leads to what's called unequal reproductive success. And that means that there's going to be certain individuals that are going to be considered more fit. And the concept of fitness is an important term to understand. When we say survival of the fittest, we don't always necessarily mean the strongest individuals survive. We mean the most fit individuals. And that term of fitness changes with the environment. So I can have a strong individual that, yes, might be fit in one environment, but if you put them in another one, there might be other characteristics that would make them better adapted and better suited for survival. So the term fitness is relative to its environment, and it can mean many different things depending on what those environmental conditions are. But when an individual is considered to be most fit, that means that they are most suited to the environment. So as a result, they will have higher reproductive success. And because they have a higher reproductive success, they're more likely to find a mate, they're more likely to have offspring, and they're more likely to pass on those adaptive traits. Over time and over generations, this would then lead to the genetic evolution of the entire population. What's important to note as well is that Charles Darwin has gotten credit for the theory of evolution. However, he was not the only scientist that was working on it, and he was not the only scientist that came up with this theory. So there was also Wallace, who was a predominant scientist around the same time, and he was coming up with a theory of evolution around the same time. And it just so happens that Charles Darwin got his paper and his theory published before he did. So there's some discrepancies, and there's some people that believe that Wallace is actually the scientist that should be credited rightfully with this theory. Another important thing to note is that in order for this theory of evolution to work, traits must be considered heritable. So it's another important term to know. When we say a trait is heritable, what we mean is that that trait has to be passed on from one generation to the next. So the theory of evolution strongly supports the idea that there's shared common ancestors among different groups of organisms. So we've got the Galapagos finches here. You can see that these 4 finches are 4 distinct species, which means they can't mate with each other anymore, and they're completely differentiated either with respect to their diet and certain physical characteristics. But if you take a look at them genetically, there is strong support that they originated from a common ancestor. So at some point in evolutionary history, a common ancestor inhabited the island, and then for some reason, either due to geographic regions, etc., they got separated out and then each adapted to their own environment in different ways to then create these 4 different species. In this other picture here in the middle, we've got Jane Goodall, who is renowned for her study and work with primates. So she recognized that through her studies, there are a lot of shared characteristics with humans, and her preliminary work was very, very integral in realizing that there are so many shared characteristics that we do have some shared common ancestry with primates. Further to support that, if you take a look at the characteristic and evolution of skull structure over time, you will also see that there's evidence for a shared common ancestor and evidence for evolution over time. We can also take a look at various homologous structures. And so homologous structures are structures that originate from a shared ancestor. But because the different offspring and different populations were exposed to different environments, even though these structures, we may have a shared common ancestor, at this point in time, we can see distinct divergence in the structure due to evolution. So for instance, we have a shared ancestor with bats. However, if you take a look at our arm, they are completely different. Ours is modified for grasping and using tools, whereas the bat is modified for flying. But if you look at the base structure, there's many shared characteristics. So we have the same bone structure as far as we have a humerus, we also have phalanges that are adapted in fingers for us, but in bats, they're adapted into the wing. And so what we call this is divergent evolution. So a shared common ancestor that then diverges into different species that are better adapted to their environment. We can also have a different type of evolution where when you have different types of organisms that come from a different ancestral line, when they start to share certain characteristics because they live in a similar environment. So if you take the bat wing, for example, here, there's going to be shared characteristics between the bat wing and between the structure and function of an insect wing, such as in a butterfly, and also a bird wing. So we call this convergent evolution, when you can see the similarities in structures, but it's simply based on the long evolutionary time being spent in similar types of environments. And these structures will then carry out similar functions, even though they came from completely different ancestors.